jurors are all present. Everyone else may be seated. Whenever you're ready. Let me just make sure. Dr. Connor, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can.
Okay, we're going to resume. You're still under oath, and Mr. Secor is at the podium, and he's going to continue his questioning. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Connor, if you would put up the slide that you were on when we left, entitled Neuropsychological Testing of Nikolas Cruz.
Can you see that?
Yeah, we see the entire, there you go, that's the full screen.
Perfect.
I just want to make sure that you were able to finish the thought that you had when we broke for lunch, but I believe you were saying that you converted Nick's scores into what you were calling Z scores, is that correct?
That's correct. A mean of 0.
Okay, and just remind us, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And then I flipped all the scores where a high score is bad so that a low score would be bad. So they just flipped the sign. I think that was where we left off.
Okay, and let me just ask you a quick number of questions before you describe to us the significance of the graph. But along the bottom, the text across the bottom of the chart is what?
Those are the test items, the names of the test items.
Okay, and then they are separated by the vertical black lines into what?
They're separated into domains, and the domain name is listed across the top.
And those domain names, are those the domains identified by the Institute of Medicine?
They were some of the domains identified by the Institute of Medicine, yes. These are domains of neuropsychological functioning that we use very frequently.
Okay, and then I'm correct that the red line is the indication of a deficit as indicated on the chart, right?
Yes, per the CDC guidelines, -2 standard deviations for IQ testing, and then -1 standard deviation for all other neuropsych testing.
Okay, and both of those standard deviations are set by the CDC, is that correct?
Yeah, those ranges were set by the CDC. It's also a fairly common practice for neuropsychology in general.
Okay, and then of course the green line, that's at 0 standard deviations, which that's you're just average person, is that correct?
Yeah, that would be the average score for each one of these, what you anticipate.
And then the blue line that's indicated on the chart as current testing, is that Nick?
Really, the dots are Mr. Cruz's scores on each of the tests. The lines are more there just to kind of help you see the pattern. It's not indicating any relationship between the scores, but it's just to help draw the eye to the dots.
Okay, and so if you would describe to us what each domain means, and then how Nick tested in each of those domains.
Okay. So the first domain having to do with IQ, intellectual functioning, standard testing of that. He had a full scale IQ. We've seen the scores of 83, and so that's what this dot here is. The green dotted line is actually his score on the IQ, full scale IQ score, so that we can kind of compare his performance on other tests against that. Like I talked about, there were very significant splits across the domains of intellectual functioning, as you can see in this image here. Second domain has to do with academics, reading, word pronunciation, basically, reading comprehension, spelling, and math calculation. All of them are below the 1 standard deviation cut point, predominantly in the mildly impaired range, with spelling that's within the mildly to moderately impaired range. Memory testing is looking at a person's ability to learn and remember information. It's both, I assess both verbal and visual spatial. The first half of this, approximately, well, till about here, has to do with verbal learning and memory. This first one is a list learning task. I read a bunch of list of words to the person. He has to repeat them back as much as possible. This first score is how much he learns, and we repeat the list a number of times to see how they learn with practice. The first dot here is Mr. Cruz's score on the learning portion of the test, the list learning test, and that was within the low average range. But he was able to retain the information, those lists, very well over time. They were in high average range for both a short delay and a long delay. Next set of scores had to do with more contextual learning, so learning of a story. This one was a relatively short set of stories, and on that he was in the low average range, both for immediate recall of them and delayed recall. The third verbal test was again, a contextual learning test, but it was a much more in-depth test. There were more components to the story. And on this, he was demonstrating significant impairments within the mildly to moderately or moderately impaired range for learning, and then mildly to moderately impaired range for delay recall. Then we move into the visual side of memory on a relatively, where he's having to copy and then recall relatively simple geometric designs. He was within the low average range for immediate recall, average range for delayed recall. But again, when you have him try and copy and remember a more complex design, he was demonstrating significantly more difficulties in the severely impaired range, moderately to severely impaired range. Next domain has to do with visual spatial construction, so being able to copy this complicated figure. And in this, he was functioning within the severely impaired range. He had considerable difficulties being able to organize his thoughts in figuring out how to approach copying a very complicated figure. Made a number of errors in the accuracy of his reconstruction. This is something that we see extremely commonly, like I had indicated as earlier on, my expectations. We see this very commonly with individuals with FASD. Next group has to do with attention. There were two different attention tests that were given. Both of them were kind of more long-term vigilance tasks where he has to pay attention for a long period of time. And on both of them, he was actually doing quite well. In the normal range to above average range. Wasn't making many mistakes. He was able to stay focused. So he was doing quite well. Interestingly, when he was a child, he was diagnosed with ADHD, but at the time of the testing, he wasn't demonstrating significant problems with that. Next domain has to do with processing speed. How you take in information, figure out understand what it is that you need to do, and then come up with a response to that. And these were relatively simple tasks that he was having to do, so it was looking at very basic processing speed. On this, he was overall doing reasonably well. He had one score that was in the impaired range, but overall he was doing reasonably well. Similarly, on the IQ testing, his processing speed score was within the average to low average range, so not too bad. Motor tasks, motor coordination. I do a couple of different tests relating to that. One of them is kind of fine motor eye-hand coordination where you're trying to put small objects into holes. And then the other one is more of a motor speed task, having to tap a key as quickly as possible. On the eye-hand coordination, he did fairly well, average to slightly below average range. But on the motor speed task, he was demonstrating significant impairments, both using his dominant left hand predominantly and his non-dominant right hand. The next large group of scores here have to do with executive functions. I kind of bounced around talking about those a little bit. Their planning, their problem solving, idea generation, things like that. And on this, he was demonstrating, and so it's not measuring a single sort of skill. It's measuring a bunch of different sorts of skills. And so on this, he was demonstrating a fair bit of variability depending on the type of executive function that was being measured. This first group had to do with idea generation, either verbally coming up with words for names, for letters, or for different types of categories of items, or generating unique ideas visually. He demonstrated mild or mild to moderate impairments in his ability to generate ideas. He also demonstrated perseverations, where he would get stuck on an idea and repeat it over and over again. Next group of scores had to do with being able to inhibit behaviors, inhibit a well-learned response. Again, he was demonstrating mild, moderate impairments on that. When you took in, oops, sorry, my bad. When you took into account how quickly he did the tasks, it was still mildly impaired in his ability to inhibit behaviors, inhibit responses. This Trails B is a task of having to quickly shift the focus of your attention. And he demonstrated significant troubles being able to adjust his focus. This next group of tests had to do with a problem-solving task that was relatively well described to him. The instructions were given pretty concretely, and all he had to do was just solve the problem, and overall did fairly well, but he demonstrated a lot of rule violations where he would not follow the rules that were given to him. Again, that was in the mildly to moderately impaired range. On a task of working memory, this is where a person has to do multiple things at the same time, keep track of multiple things. He was demonstrating considerable impairments, especially when he didn't have a lot of time to kind of get accustomed to doing multiple things. When he had time to get accustomed to it, so this is when he's doing two things at once for a short period of time. This is for an intermediate period of time, and this is for a long period of time. When you had him do it for the long period of time, he was doing a little bit better, but it was still mildly to moderately impaired. He still had difficulties, considerable difficulties, being able to manage multiple things at the same time. A test of problem solving where he has to quickly shift between different types of problem solving. Some of them are mathematical, some of them are language, some of them are more visual spatial. And he had difficulties with that performing in the mildly impaired range. On another task that was a little bit more abstract in its problem solving, and where we don't give a lot of instruction on how to perform the task, he was still doing reasonably well, but it took him many trials to be able to figure out how to solve the problem. So initial problem solving for him was very difficult. Once he got the idea, he was able to do a little bit better. Kind of fits with the working memory, where if he became accustomed to it, he was able to do a little bit better. Then we've got another abstract reasoning task where it's dealing with language-based abstract reasoning. And he was kind of right in the borderline to mildly impaired on his ability to understand abstract concepts. The last group of tests within the executive function realm has to do with suggestibility. Like I'd said, people with FASD often have a lot of difficulties. They tend to be highly suggestible. So we have them learn a story, and then we ask them questions about the story. And then we tell them that they made mistakes. They have to go through the questions again. So we see how many times they endorse misleading or questions that are not part of the story the first time through, and how many times they do the second time through, so how many times they shift their answers. And with Mr. Cruz, kind of low average range for initially agreeing to items that were not on the story. But when we went through the story the questions the second time, he was demonstrating much more impairments. So his overall suggestibility was within the mildly impaired range. This last group here have to do with 3 different domains. They all relate to adaptive skills, adaptive functioning, day-to-day life. One of them has to do with language, both expressive and receptive. Another has to do with social interpretation of social cues. And then the third one has to do with day-to-day skills, counting money, telling time, things like that. And those are direct measures that were administered to Mr. Cruz. This was a interview that was, that was completed with Mr. Cruz's adoptive mother when Mr. Cruz was 3.5 years old, looking at those same areas of adaptive functioning. And we see that he's demonstrating on direct testing, either mild or mild to moderate impairments in receptive and expressive communication, also noted by the mother on the interview when he was young. Social interpretation was a little bit less impacted on current testing, although he did have a score of where he had significant difficulties making inferences of emotional content. But other areas or other aspects of identifying, facial expression or other tone issues of tone of voice was not in the impaired range. Although at the time his mother indicated that it was his stronger suit, but still an area of weakness. And then in daily living skills on current testing, he was demonstrating significant impairments.
All right, thank you. Just a couple of questions before we move on. The effort testing that you described to us earlier, is that the effort testing exists throughout this graph, but it is not specifically identified?
Yeah, they're not identified in this graph. They're not scores that you would interpret for level of functioning or dysfunction. They're check digits to see if the person is working hard.
Okay.
The testing was administered throughout the course of all these tests that were given.
And I think you partially answered this, but just so that I'm clear, why are there numerous tests in some domains, fewer in others, and then in at least one, there's only one test in the visual spatial domain?
Right. These are the sorts of tests that we found in research to be very consistent. Or very sensitive to the impact of prenatal alcohol exposure. And one of the primary ones, let's just talk about the visual spatial, because there's only one score. In visual spatial, one of the primary ones that's been found in almost all the research has been this particular test, the Ray complex figure copy, that it is particularly sensitive. Having said that, he had difficulties on nonverbal visual spatial construction on the IQ test as well. I just don't include that into this visual spatial domain.
Okay. And you described for the motor domain that requires Nick to be actually taking an item and then placing it into some sort of keyhole or something. But regarding the other kinds of testing, are these verbal tests? Is he writing something down, or are you writing down what he says? How does it work?
It's a combination. Some of them are simply question and answer. I'm asking questions, he's answering, I write it down. Others, he's doing a computerized test. Others, he's actually manipulating items. So it's a lot of different sorts of things. Some of them are all verbal, some of them are more visual. And
what do you do to ensure that you're getting down the most accurate information when he's giving you answers?
Yeah, when I'm recording his responses, if he's giving me verbal responses, I will type, because I type much quicker than I can write. My handwriting is not very legible, and also I do have some troubles with my hands that I get some pretty decent pain when I'm writing for any length of time, and I can type a whole lot quicker, so I'm able to type and keep up with what he's saying while when he's answering questions.
Okay. Now, did you compare the neuropsychological testing results? Well, actually, let me ask you this first. I'm sorry. What you see once you graph Nick's scores, is this indicative of the pattern that you would expect to see of somebody with a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder?
Very much so. Like I'd said before, we're looking for at least deficits in at least 3 domains that are at least 1 standard deviation below the mean, or discrepancies. We have discrepancies on IQ. That's 1. We have academic impairments. We have memory impairments, learning and memory impairments. We have visual spatial impairments, motor impairments, executive functioning impairments, receptive and expressive communication, both on direct and on informant report, and mother's report from childhood, and socialization impairments reported by mother, less obvious with on direct testing, and daily living impairments. So 9 out of the 11 domains that were assessed here had impairments.
And you said that you would need 3 for somebody to be consistent with having an FASD. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And if you are, according to the neuropsychological standards or standard deviations, if you're below 1, I think you said that's a mild impairment. Is that correct?
Yes. Between 1 and 2 standard deviations is essentially mildly impaired. There's gradations that you can do from there. From 2 to 3 is moderately impaired, and from -3 and below, it's severely impaired.
And does that descriptor, whether it's mild, moderate, or severe, does that have any bearing on whether or not the domain is met for purposes of your assessment?
No.
All right. Did you compare your neuropsychological testing or neuropsychological testing scores of Nick to any other neuropsychological testing done of Nick?
Yeah, the state had asked for an expert to go in and do some more testing with Mr. Cruz after mine had been completed, and he administered a number of tests, some of which overlapped with the ones that I'd given or we'd given, but others were slightly different. The state's expert did do performance validity testing. So looking at how much effort Mr. Cruz was putting out, he performed well on that test. So there was no indication that he was malingering or putting out poor effort. So that's with respect to the performance validity. He also gave some intellectual testing, a different test than the one that we use. We use the WACE. He used what's called the Reynolds Intellectual Assessment Scales. He actually ended up with much lower scores than were found on the IQ testing that was done by, actually Dr. Black had done this testing, but found very similar overall intellectual functioning, 83 versus a 78. That's about 5 points difference, and noted splits across the domains of IQ, consistent with the testing that was done by myself or Dr. Black. Oops, sorry. Similarly, processing speed, he did administer the processing speed domain from the WACE, and scores were very consistent across, 92 when he was seen by Dr. Black, and 89 when the state's expert saw him, very consistent. Copying of that complex visual spatial figure, both times severely impaired range.
All
right. He did some more testing. The memory component of that complex figure did slightly better on the testing by the state's expert, but still well within the impaired range. For immediate recall, so very short recall after a couple of minutes. Delayed recall, again, severely impaired on both assessments. When he did the testing with us for looking at just recognition, was this on that figure? Was that on that figure? He did slightly better, still impaired, slightly better, and had more difficulties when it was done by the state's expert. 2 different types of other aspects of visual learning and memory, but overall did slightly better on the testing that was done by Dr. Black and myself, slightly more difficulties and mild impairments on shape learning from the state's expert assessment. And then the state's expert administered the Mazes test, which is not one that we've used. We haven't done any research on that in FASD. So honestly, I don't know how that would usually play out for people with FASD. But in this case, he was in the average range. When we did a testing that looked at sort of an aspect of tracking, he was having greater difficulties on testing that was done. And these were tests that are part of the research that we've done over the years on FASD. He was demonstrating more difficulty. So overall, there was very good agreement. A few areas that were slightly different. And the state's expert and our current assessment both were indicating that that Mr. Cruz was putting out very good effort.
And just so that we're clear, in the upper right-hand corner of this chart, it's kind of being blocked by the image of you, but I think the title of that column is consistent, correct?
Yes, yes.
And then the first word is partial, and the second word is yes, indicating the degree to which it was consistent?
Yes.
Okay. Now, just to make sure that I am correct about this, with T-scores, what is normal?
A normal score, an average score on T-score is a 50.
And the standard deviation is what?
10. So basically 40 would be the cut point. And
so why are there some scores that are just identified regarding being less than 20?
This test, once it gets below 20, it doesn't give you the exact score anymore, the exact T-score. It's just, it is now in the severely impaired range, and anything below it is still severely impaired.
So whether it's 19 or 2, it's considered severely impaired?
Yes.
Okay. Now, next thing I wanted to ask you about is Nick has had IQ testing at various points in his life, and I was wondering if you could describe to us how you see the comparison between those tests that he has received at different points.
Okay. So yeah, he has. So he had a different IQ test, the Stanford Binet, when he was 5 years old, and when he was administered that, his full scale IQ was 77. That's in the borderline range. He also demonstrated a little bit of variability across domains, was poorer on the verbal, a little bit better on the nonverbal, but verbal was in the borderline range, nonverbal was in the low average range. When he was 10, he was administered an earlier version of the Reynolds intellectual assessment scales. And his scores were better. Had a full scale IQ of 93, and then again, slightly more challenging with the verbal versus the nonverbal. One of the things that research has shown is that in general, the Reynolds, the RIAS tends to score a little bit higher than other IQ tests. So it's possible it could be part of a measurement between the RIAS versus a Wechsler. This was the testing that was done by Dr. Black as part of the current evaluation. We've talked about that overall score. In the low average range, but relatively consistent with the score back when he was 5 years old. And then this was the testing that was done by the state's expert, again, back into the borderline range. So overall, the scores have been borderline to low average, with the exception of when he was 10 years old. And it's possible that is related to the test itself tending to score a little higher.
And the empty boxes there in the working memory and processing speed columns, are those things not tested by those various tests?
They weren't reported in the records, and in some of them they aren't part of the test. But yeah, they just weren't reported in the records.
And in IQ testing, I think you said the standard deviation is how many points?
Full scale IQ is a mean of 100. Standard deviation is 15.
Okay.
So here's 1.5, just more than 1.5 below. This is 1.5 below.
All right. Now, next thing, also regarding testing that Nick has had throughout the course of his life, did you look at his academics across his lifespan?
Yes.
But before you go on, let me just make sure that I can't remember where I made this clear or not, but why is it significant for you when you're doing neuropsychological testing to look at a person's performance across their lifespan?
Yeah, so in order for a person's current functioning to be considered consistent with FASD, we need to know that there were troubles during earlier portions of life. If a person was doing fine until they're 16, 17, 18 years old, and then suddenly they have a decline in functioning, it's a pattern that we don't expect to see for FASD. It's a pattern I expect to see for a traumatic brain injury or a stroke. So we're looking to see if there were indications of impairments earlier in life, and so that could be participation in special education services, but especially I'm looking for testing, standardized tests that were administered earlier in life.
Okay. And did you look at that standardized testing of Nick's across across the records that you reviewed across his lifespan?
I did.
And can you tell us about those, please?
Yeah, so from the academic perspective, the red marked sections all are for performances that were below grade level. So these are showing grade equivalents basically. So when Mr. Cruz was in the 3rd grade at age 10, his reading pronunciation was at a 2nd grade level, below grade level. Similarly for comprehension, spelling was between a 1st and a 2nd grade level. When he was in 4th grade, again, below grade average. And that was pretty much consistent all the way across. There were a few areas where he was doing better at certain times. You know, on more straight calculation type problems on math, he did relatively well in the 5th and 6th grade. But when you do story problems, more complex mathematics, and having to do more abstraction, considerably below expectations based on grade level. And this persisted all the way through until the testing that was done recently as part of this case. And
is that, are the struggles that are represented on this graph consistent with the impairments that were found by your testing?
Very much so.
Then that was regarding academic achievement, but what about communication as indicated by records from throughout his life?
Yes, same sort of a pattern. Now we switch back to percentiles. So what we're looking for are percentiles that are 16 or below. And those are all denoted in the red. Again, there are a couple times when he's doing relatively well. Again, 6th, 8th grade sort of things. But for the most part, he's doing quite poorly, both for receptive skills and especially for expressive skills. Some of these are within the severely impaired range for both of those. And again, that includes on current testing. So again, it's consistent across his age from pre-kindergarten, when he was 3 years old, was demonstrating significant both receptive and expressive all the way up till age of 22.
Okay. And the few places there where he appears to have scored pretty well, how do you interpret that, or how do you explain that in relation to the other things that are indicative of impairments?
Yeah, we talked about really earlier that there is some issue that people with FASD can be pretty variable. One time they get it, the next time they're not quite following it, or they have greater difficulty. So it's possible that it's down to some of this variability of performance over over the course of time. But he had this Peabody picture vocabulary test in 1st and 2nd grade, was doing okay, but by 3rd grade he was demonstrating significant impairments.
Okay. Now, what about testing from his life in regards to visual motor skills?
Yeah, there was an assessment that was done when he was 5 years old that was looking at a test where he had to copy geometric figures, basically. And his performance was at the 3rd percentile. So that's in the mildly to moderately impaired range. So that was when he was 5 years old. And then the testing that was done as part of this current evaluation, both by Dr. Black, myself, and by the state's expert, was below the 1st percentile.
And when something is indicated as being in the 3rd percentile, or we're talking about the bottom third, the bottom of
Yes.
the, okay.
Yeah, meaning 97% of the people do better than him and only 3% do worse.
Okay. And what about executive functioning as indicated by testing throughout his life?
Yeah, again, there was some early executive function testing that was done when he was 5 years old, where he was functioning at the mildly to moderately impaired range, 2 standard deviations below the mean. Also at age 5, there was one aspect of that Stanford-Binet IQ test had to do with fluid reasoning and working memory. Both of those were in the impaired range. On the current testing, when you average all of those 32 tests that you saw, or scores that you saw on that graph, his score comes out to 0.9 below the average, below the mean, so slightly above that cut point. But the problem, like I'd said, is that that executive functioning is a lot of different sorts of skills. So averaging a lot of different sorts of skills isn't necessarily the most appropriate way to represent them. But just to give a brief overview, he was still showing difficulties across executive functioning on current testing.
All right. Now, the adaptive functioning that you looked at or that you included in your assessment and in that graph was a consequence, I believe, of some sort of assessment that was given to Linda Cruz. Is that correct?
That's correct. She participated in the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales, an interview that looks at adaptive functioning. This was during the school evaluation when Mr. Cruz was 3.5 years old.
Okay, and what did, maybe just give us a quick explanation of what the purpose of a Vineland is. Why would a mother be asked to do a Vineland of her child?
Yeah, so this is, like I said, adaptive functioning. So this is how the person, how Mr. Cruz can function as independently as a 3.5-year-old at that time would be able to do. So based on the expectations for other 3.5-year-olds. How is he able to communicate? How is he able to kind of manage day-to-day things? How is he able to socialize? And in the child, in children, they also look at motor coordination, motor skills. And in all of those, he was reported her responses to questions ended up indicating functioning that was significantly impaired. Overall adaptive functioning was at a score of 66. Again, this is with a mean of 100, so that means he was more than 2 standard deviations below the mean, which does put him into the his adaptive functioning into the range of intellectual disability, similar range to that, as we had seen in research on individuals with FASD, so quite consistent there. But across the board in all domains, communication, daily living, socialization, and motor skills were all significantly below average.
And so you said Nick at this point was 3.5?
That's correct.
And so overall, what does this assessment give him in terms of the age at which he's functioning when he's 3.5 years old?
Yeah, overall, he was functioning at about a 2-year, 1-month level. So he was 11 months behind at that point in his life. And
you said that this is just an assessment that is given to his adoptive mother, and it's scored based solely on her answers. Is that right?
That's right.
Is there anything in Nick's records that you saw that could either corroborate or contradict the types of things that Linda Cruz said about Nick at that time?
Mm-hmm. Well, just starting back at the communication side of things, here she's indicating impairments. At the same time, I'll back up a little bit to the communication that was direct testing of Mr. Cruz that was done at the same time. He was also demonstrating significant impairments in communication. So consistent with what mom reported, the examiners were finding the same sorts of troubles on direct testing. Visual motor sorts of things. He was having some difficulties with the visual motor construction, which might fit in with the visual motor skills. And when it comes to socialization, several of the evaluations that were done, including when he was at 5 years old, were noting significant troubles with kind of misperceptions and difficulties in those areas. So there were definitely some consistencies with what Ms. Cruz was reporting versus what the direct testing and what others were observing too.
Okay. And am I right that that's important because the Vineland thing is just sort of based on what somebody says, whereas the testing is a little bit more concrete?
They both provide quite useful information, but yes, the direct testing is his ability level versus somebody's perception of his ability level.
Okay. So based on your review of the records and looking at the testing across his lifespan, do you believe that he had neuropsychological impairments throughout his life?
Yes.
And what are the things that lead you to believe that?
Well, like we said, the adaptive functioning impairments when he was 3.5 years old, psychological evaluation that was done when he was 5, IQ testing was borderline range with the variability, and he was noted to have impairments or difficulties in all of these areas: visual spatial, working memory, managing multiple things at the same time, fluid reasoning, that's abstract, that's executive functioning, language, comprehension and expression, tending to have misperceptions, again, the problem solving language skills, set shifting between things, we saw that on current testing, organizational abilities, moving into the executive function and being able to understand that, as well as impulsivity and troubles with learning. He was diagnosed with ADHD when he was 6 years old. They had tried him on medication management also, and all throughout school, like I said, he was demonstrating below grade level performance on academic testing.
In your experience working with people who have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, is being diagnosed with ADHD, is that something that you see?
Quite commonly. It's usually the first diagnosis that a child will get before they're eventually diagnosed with FASD, because there is overlap in that impulsive behavior and difficulties paying attention.
Okay. Now I'd like to ask you about, to discuss with us regarding Nick's scores and the way that you put them on a graph, but talk to us about the concept of variability of his scoring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like I said, one of the things that I do expect to see is the variability. They do well in some areas, do poorly in other areas. Everybody has some variability. Everybody's going to do well in some and less well in others. But with FASD, we tend to see that being more exaggerated. So again, if you look at his kind of IQ score, full scale IQ score, you see these very significant ranges of areas where he's doing really well, above average, to areas where he's in the severely impaired range. So this kind of a sawtooth pattern is something that is very commonly seen with FASD individuals. And
so if the average is 0, the solid green line, or the average or mean being 0, if a person has an average IQ, obviously their scoring's not going to be exactly straight across on that line, right. A little bit above and a little bit below, is that correct? Yes, so usually that's certainly the case at kind of if you're looking at the general population, but even for a normal person, so if you take into account their IQ, it tends to hover around that score as well, with some strengths, some weaknesses again, but it tends to be relatively hovering around that, that's in this case, that dotted line. You talked about the splits in Nick's IQ testing across his lifespan, but tell me, is that significant to you regarding your assessment of him? Yeah, so if we blow up this image right here, we see that he is showing significant splits between verbal comprehension, so verbal sorts of skills, and working memory sorts of things, and also between processing speed and working memory. And then there's a significant split, but a little bit less magnitude between verbal and nonverbal. So those splits
They're non-specific. It basically raises a red flag that there's something potentially neurological going on, whether it be neurodevelopmental or some sort of acquired injury like a brain injury. So it's non-specific from that perspective, but we see it very frequently in FASD as well.
Okay. Now, you talked a little bit earlier about higher complex tasks, but is that the same thing as talking about lower structure and higher abstraction?
They're looking at similar sorts of ideas. They're not quite the same, but yeah, it's where there's more structure, where you have a better idea of what you need to do versus in situations where you don't have that kind of structure and don't have as good of an idea of what you need to do, or it becomes more complicated.
Okay. And what did you observe regarding Nick's IQ as compared to his academic ability as compared to his adaptive functioning?
Mm-hmm. Oops, sorry. So yeah, this is Mr. Cruz scores on the current testing. Here's his full scale IQ, which was 83. You've got the dotted line this is what you expect. He's doing more poorly than you expect based off of his academics, which is what we would anticipate seeing with somebody who's has an IEP or so he's doing more poorly there. But when you move into kind of what he knows versus what he can do and how he can apply it independently, he was doing significantly worse. When you look at it in relation to other individuals with ARND or PFA or partial FAS, it's very much the same pattern. This is the type of pattern that I expect to see, where there's this disconnection and downward slope from higher structure, higher knowledge to lower structure and needing to do things more independently.
And in regards to that downward slope, did you see that also in his language testing? I mean, memory language testing, as well as visual spatial memory testing?
I did. So on the left side, this is language learning and memory. So when the language test was concrete, highly structured, a list of words, he did well. As the test became more complex, more challenging, having him remember some short stories, not as well, low average. But when I had him trying to remember longer stories and more complicated information in those stories, he had significantly greater problems. So this downward trend from less complex to greater complexity. Same sort of thing with the visual spatial memory. When he had to copy and remember relatively simple figures, geometric figures, did okay. When he had to remember much more complicated figures that weren't necessarily geometrical, considerably greater difficulties, again, as it became more complex.
And is this what you would expect to see in a person with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder?
Yes.
And then how about that downward slope regarding adaptive functioning?
Yeah, so there's a lot of overlap between executive functions and adaptive skills. So being able to generate ideas more independently, being able to understand concepts and things like that. But when you're in kind of the more direct measures, more structured and setting of a test of his skills, he does slightly better than if you're just looking at his ability to do things, if somebody is reporting on his ability to do things on a day-to-day basis. Similarly, we're seeing kind of as his ability to apply some of those things as far as language goes and adaptive skills and kind of daily living adaptive skills, we're seeing this downward trend between the higher structure of direct testing and the lack of structure when it's kind of in the real world, trying to apply those.
Okay. Now, another thing that is tested, if you could just discuss with us briefly, is suggestibility and why that's tested.
Yeah, like I said, we do measure suggestibility. Individuals with FASD do tend to be suggestible. And so we want to assess that as much as possible. And so we do that in kind of, it's more of a, it's kind of like they call it interrogative. It's kind of like an interrogation style where you ask a bunch of questions, say a person does something wrong, it was incorrect, and then they have to ask the questions again and see if they change their answers. And people with FASD are pretty highly prone to that. So we do assess it.
And what did, hang on just a second. How did he score on suggestibility?
Okay. So the first two parts of it, so this is Mr. Cruz Raw Score, so the absolute score that he got on each of these items. This first group here is from the test manual, comparing against other individuals, other adults. This is also from the test manual, comparing against individuals that had been diagnosed with intellectual disabilities. This was a small group of individuals with FASD who had been involved in forensic criminal cases, published study. And then this was a published study of individuals with FASD who were just in the clinically. They weren't involved in any litigation or criminal cases. And what we see is that compared to the normal individuals, and we saw that on the graph, compared to kind of the normative group, Mr. Cruz is doing significantly worse with respect to immediate recall, immediately remembering a story, and delayed recall of that story, but fairly consistent with his performances for individuals with intellectual disabilities, the forensic population of FASD, and the clinical population of FASD. Relatively consistent there. When it comes to endorsing the questions that weren't in the story, the first time through, again, not significantly worse than it was trending towards poorer performance. Higher scores bad here. Tending towards poorer performance against compared to the adult general population, but relatively consistent with the other groups. When it comes to going through that same set of questions a second time, and does he endorse more, which he did, that was significantly worse than the adult general population, but relatively consistent with intellectual disabilities or FASD. When it came to the actual shift, how many times did he really change his answers? Again, worse than general population. He actually did a little bit better than the FASD criminal population. Did a little bit better on that. And so overall suggestibility, again, significantly worse than the normal population, but relatively consistent with those with intellectual disabilities and the clinical population of people with FASD.
All right. Now there was a graph that I think was produced by one of the state doctors comparing Nick to individuals in the juvenile justice system. And did you review that?
I did.
And can you show us the graph that you made of that information?
Yes. Let's see. Yes. So the purple dots, this was a study from Canada of juveniles in the justice system. These were age 12 to 18-year-olds. So mean age was about 15, a little bit younger than Mr. Cruz at the time of our testing. They were also diagnosed using the Canadian FAS guidelines. The Canadian guidelines are more restrictive than the guidelines that I use. Instead of that, identifying the deficit at 1 standard deviation below the mean like I do based off of the CDC, they use a cutoff of 2 standard deviations below the mean. So a person has to be moderately impaired in order for them to identify as an impairment at all. So it was a little bit more restrictive group. So as you might expect, Mr. Cruz was doing a little bit better. But this green swath that you see here, that is the standard deviation range that was reported in the study of the juveniles, the youth with relating to FASD. And so in nearly all, so there's 20 scores that are represented here. In 13 of them, 13 of them, Mr. Cruz's performance was within the range of one standard deviation, either above or below the mean. So for the most part, fairly consistent. There's a couple places where he's significantly better. This was in that list learning task. He did better on that than that group. And then he did worse on this motor coordination task of the finger tapping, being able to tap his fingers quickly, so motor speed. He had difficulties. But for most of the other scores, it was within that range. So pretty consistent, even though these individuals were being diagnosed with a much more restrictive system.
Okay. Now, if you would, I'd like you to summarize your findings of Nick's testing and his your examination of his testing across his lifespan.
Right. So based on the current testing, as I said before, Mr. Cruz is demonstrating deficits in 9 different domains of functioning. Splits across domains of intellectual functioning, we talked about that. Academic impairments, all 3 aspects that were assessed, or that were part of the assessment here. And so as far as the splits across domains, these were found early on at age 5. Academic impairments, like I'd said, found throughout his schooling on standardized testing. Impairments in learning and memory of complex language and visual spatial information. Memory impairments were found on testing when he was 5 years old. Visual spatial construction, poor organization, again, on testing that was done when he was 5, he also demonstrated impairments there. Fine motor speed, his mother had indicated that at 3.5 years old, but there was no testing that was indicating it directly when he was younger. The executive functioning, so he was demonstrating impairments in idea generation, inhibition, able to quickly shift the focus of attention, working memory, initial problem solving, those perseverations, doing things over and over again, even if they're not helping you, and the suggestibility. There were impairments in executive functioning found when he was 5 years old. Expressive and receptive communication, both on direct testing that was done currently, and on informant report when he was 3.5 years old, and also on testing that was done both at 3.5 and 5 years old. Daily living skills was found on current testing, as well as found at age 3.5 based off of his adoptive mother's report. And the socialization functioning, primarily reported both by the mother when he was 3.5, and also noted in the school records or in the evaluation when he was 5. So he's demonstrating deficits in 9 out of the 11 domains that were assessed currently.
Okay, and then at the bottom there regarding the significant functional disabilities.
Yeah, so we're seeing that, yes, there are a lot of deficits across a lot of domains, but you can have deficits, but not in several domains, but not that widespread as far as how many scores were impaired, or looking at kind of what the severity levels are. So overall, from that graph that we looked at earlier, 53% of Mr. Cruz's current test scores were within the impaired range. 53%, more than half of those scores were in the impaired range. Of those, 40% were in either the mildly or mildly to moderately impaired range. So the large majority were in that range. But still, 7.5% were in the moderately to severely impaired range, and 6% were within the severely impaired range. So not only are we seeing a lot of scores that are impaired, typically with a normal individual, we actually do anticipate seeing impairments on neuropsychological testing, but usually that's 15%, maybe as high as 20%. Here we're seeing 53%, far in excess of what you'd expect to see if he was a normal individual. And we're seeing mostly mild or mild to moderate, but still areas of quite significant, much more significant impairment. And regardless of what that level, it has an impact on his functioning.
Now, you mentioned on that graph that had that you added the green swath to show the range of standard deviations from the norm. And I think you said that that was from a study that was based in Canada. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you said that the diagnostic or criteria in Canada is more strict. And just tell me briefly what you mean by that.
Yeah, so like I said, on the CDC's guidelines that I use for my evaluations requires deficits of at least one standard deviation below the mean. So 16th percentile. The Canadian guidelines also are looking for deficits in at least 3 domains, but they have to be 2 standard deviations below the mean. So basically at about a 2nd percentile. So that's the Canadian guidelines that they use up there.
Are there guidelines that use a standard deviation other than 1, as the CDC uses, and other than 2, as they use in Canada?
Yeah, there's another another group. Hoyme was the lead author on it. In 2015, they published their attempts to more operationalize the IOM's guidelines. And they set the cut point at 1.5 standard deviation below the mean. So basically, they're looking for it's got to be mildly to moderately impaired range, and not including those that were more mildly impaired. And
I know the CDC requires, I think you said, impairments in 3 domains. Is that correct?
Right.
And do some of these other criteria use a different number in terms of the number of domains that need to be impaired?
Slightly. I mean, and Hoyme talks about the Hoyme ones that are the minus 1.5 do talk about 4 domains, but they're spread out. So it's IQ, there's neuropsych, there's behavior, and there's developmental. So it's looking at those areas in slightly different ways than the CDC does, but it's still looking at kind of behavior over looking at those impairments in behavior.
So if you apply the different standards as identified by the CDC or by Canada or by the IOM, if you apply different standards to Nick's neuropsychological testing, does it change your opinion about what his neuropsychological testing is indicative of?
No. If you use the Canadian guidelines, he would still have deficits in 7 domains.
And is the Canadian one the most stringent of the ones that you're aware of?
Yes.
Okay. And that opinion that you have based on his testing and your record review, if you would just summarize your ultimate opinion for us.
That Mr. Cruz's pattern of functioning is consistent with the diagnosis of neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure, as in DSM-5. It's also consistent with the IOM and CDC guidelines for pattern of neuropsychological impairments for individuals with FASD. And it is consistent with the medical diagnosis of alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, or ARND, that was made by Dr. Jones, who you'll hear from later.
Okay, John, if I may have just a moment.
Sure.
Just one last thing. Dr. Connor, if you can hear me.
Yes, sorry.
That's all right. Going back to the actual administration of this neuropsychological testing that you did of Nick, the actual process of being at the jail and doing it, is there a reason why it's not recorded in some way, meaning audio recorded?
Yes.
And what's that?
Well, there's been ample research that use of third-party observation, so somebody else sitting in and observing testing be administered, whether that be a human being sitting in the room or some sort of recording device, whether it be audio or video, has an impact on test-taking behavior. It changes how the person responds. So very much the recommendation, the admonition from all neuropsychological societies is that you don't allow third-party observers. The other aspect of it is that if a person is sitting in, they are now being shown test material that is copyrighted and needs to be kept secure. And if a test is no longer secure, and let's say the questions are released in some way, then that test would likely lose its validity, and later down the road, we wouldn't be able to use that test. So we have ethical and legal requirements that we not allow the test that we protect the security of those tests. So for both of those reasons, we don't allow, and I do not allow, a third-party observer, or whether it be a human or video or audio recorded while I'm doing testing.
All right. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your time very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to take a 15-minute recess. Please do not discuss the case. Please leave your notepads behind. The jurors have been excused. We're going to be in recess. It's 3:47. I'd like to start back up in 15 minutes. I have to give the jurors, you all know, a little bit longer because there's so many of them. may be seated and state when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, good afternoon, Dr. Connor. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good.
How about yourself?
Good. So let me start off. Are you board certified in neuropsychology?
I am not.
How do you become board certified in neuropsychology?
It's a voluntary process, not required in order to practice as a neuropsychologist, but it requires a period of study, to take a written exam, then to provide various work samples that are reviewed, and then eventually participate in an oral examination.
And you have not done that?
That's correct.
Okay. Are you board certified in forensic psychology?
No, I'm not.
Do you have any formal training in forensic psychology?
No.
Are you board certified in any discipline?
No.
Do you recognize the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And do you recognize that as an authoritative source?
It's one of the several neuropsychological societies in the United States. It's a very good one.
Okay. And do you have the American Academy of Clinical Psychology listed on your CV?
No, I have the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology.
Oh, I'm sorry, neuropsychology.
That's okay.
Yes.
Yes.
I thought that's what I was speaking about.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, and you're a member?
I am.
Okay. Are you a full member or an affiliate?
I'm an affiliate member.
Okay. Is it against the bylaws to put in writing or orally that you're a member of the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology?
That I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Well, if you get a chance, I suggest you check. I think it says that you have to be, to say you're a member of the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology or to print it. And I may be wrong, but it indicates you can't do that unless you're a full member.
Your Honor, just object to testifying by counsel, please.
Overruled.
Okay. Okay. Are you licensed to practice psychology in the state of Florida?
I'm not.
How many criminal cases have you been involved in where Dr. Richard Adler has been involved?
I do not know the exact number.
Hold on just a second, please. What is the objection?
Relevance, please.
You want to argue this?
Can you speak to the lawyer's sidebar, please?
Okay, Dr. Connor, you can answer. You want me to repeat the question?
Please do.
Sure. How many criminal cases have you been involved in when Dr. Richard Adler was also involved in the same case?
I do not know the exact answer to that.
Okay,
It has been a number of cases.
okay. If I said approximately 150 cases, would you agree or disagree?
If you're including cases where I was only consulting, but was not doing an evaluation, then that's possible, yes.
Okay. And did you recommend Dr. Adler in this case?
I do not recall if I had recommended Dr. Adler or if the team had already approached him.
Okay. And you indicated to Mr. Secor that you've been hired by the state in criminal cases?
Yes.
And you said for evaluating victims. How many victims have you evaluated for the government in your career?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead. You were going to answer. I don't want to interrupt you.
I've testified in one of those cases. I've had a couple of cases.
Okay. So once. Okay. So how many cases, let me put it this way. What percentage of your income is derived from you being hired by defense attorneys in criminal cases?
I don't know the specific percentage of my income. I know the percentage of my work that is criminal versus clinical.
So you have no idea what percentage of your income is derived by being hired by criminal defense attorneys in criminal cases?
I don't track that number in my software.
And you have no idea?
I do make more from criminal cases, for sure.
Right.
And about 60% of my work is clinical.
So do you have no idea how you would answer my question? How much of your income is derived by being hired by criminal defense attorneys in criminal cases?
I derive more income from criminal cases than I do from clinical cases, yes. I don't know the exact number.
Okay. And you don't know what the money number is? Is that what you're saying?
No.
Okay. When were you hired in this case?
I'm sorry?
When were you hired in this case?
I was contacted in December of 2020, and the contract was finalized in March of 2021.
Okay. And when?
March
Of 2020?
2021.
2021. Okay. And then you met with the defendant on May 20th, 2021?
Correct.
Okay. And you met with him for 5 hours?
Yes.
And where was that?
That was at Broward County Jail. I don't know the specific name of it, sorry.
Okay. That's fine. And it was all in one day?
Yes,
And you did some interviewing?
that's correct.
What percentage of the 5 hours did you do interviewing?
That's usually about 1 hour.
Okay. Did you videotape that 1 hour?
No, I did not.
Did you audio tape that 1 hour?
I did not.
Because that wouldn't be interfering with any of your testing, would it?
No, but it is also not part of my practice to video or audio tape any of my evaluation.
Okay. Did you know in the state of Florida that defense counsel has a right to be present during any testing or any interview of one of their clients?
I was made aware of that.
Okay. And are you aware when a state expert examines a defendant in a criminal case, not only does defense counsel have a right to be there, but it has to be videotaped? Did you know that, Dr. Connor?
I don't recall that.
Your Honor, may we have a sidebar, please? Sure. for a moment. There's too much commotion and back and forth that needs to go on for you all to be sitting here with that annoying white noise. So, please don't discuss the cases. The case, please leave your notepads behind and we'll be back with you shortly. Thank you.
I just want to clarify precisely what my objection was.
Okay, just hang on one second.
Sure.
Please. First of all, this was an agreed order. This is not my order. This is agreed. I knew by the way it's formatted.
Well, with all due respect, it is a court order.
Okay, a court order, but
Agreed by the parties.
Yeah,
which
we're not
means,
saying-
that's why I'm not so familiar with the issue, because when you all agree, I read the order and I sign off on it. So, you're right, it's still a court order, but,
Just so the objection is clear for the record, what the defense is objecting to was Mr. Satz's statement that the law in the state of Florida requires that expert evaluations be videotaped. The law in the state of Florida does not require that. It happened in this case by agreement of the parties, as the court has just noted on the record. The order that you signed, I believe it was February 28, 2022. The reason why the defense proceeded to ask Dr. Connor about his procedures and methodology that he implements as to whether or not he videotapes expert evaluations of criminal defendants, that is not his practice. And like what I already just said, is throughout the depositions of our experts, the state has made inferences that our experts were doing something wrong because they didn't videotape. So by the state asking Dr. Connor if he's aware of a law in the state of Florida that requires the videotaping of expert evaluations of criminal defendants, which it does not, that in fact is misleading the juror into thinking that Dr. Connor did something improper by not doing it.
okay.
Does that make sense, Judge?
It does.
Okay.
But I think that the state can just rephrase their question, and then if both sides agree to just stay away from this area, because this is gonna be confusing.
I'm fine with that. As
The
long as-
witness is gonna have to concede that although that's his practice, that under certain circumstances, it's appropriate. For example, when a court orders it.
We wouldn't have agreed to it if the law was, I remember the law was provided, and that's why because our experts don't want to do it either. Why would we do that?
Mr. Sachs, I don't remember. When you all agree to something, but I don't do the legwork and the research, I leave that up to you. So maybe the best practice would be to excuse the jury for the evening. It's 4:30. You all can look into this. We can reconvene 30 minutes before the jurors come back tomorrow, and you all can show me what you agreed to.
But I seem to have a recollection, Judge, that because you were only allowing 2 experts in for the state to evaluate the defendant, you wanted to videotape so that you could show it to your other
No,
experts.
that was an advantage of it, but that's not why we agreed to it. We almost lost an expert because he said it,
No,
you know.
I need to refresh my memory, quite frankly, and
Okay,
I can't do it right now because I really don't remember this at
We'll
all.
accept your suggestion that we recess and we research it.
Okay, like I said, I sign off on it, but when both sides agree, I'm not as involved in the research, so.
There's been a lot of pleadings, and I have to review them too.
Okay, so, I will have, how about if we reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock and I'll have the jurors here at 9:30? Do you think that will give us enough time?
Perfect.
Or is there any way we can just skip this particular issue and have him continue his testimony until 5, and then, will you think you'll be going over till tomorrow, Mr. Sats, and then we can deal with that issue since we already have the witness here?
I'd rather deal with it now so we get a flow of the,
It feels like it's been a long day for Monday. I know we didn't start till 10:40, but we all started earlier.
Yeah, we just had 2 other experts that we flew in for tomorrow, but
Well, since this person is on, I don't know what else to do. It's 4:30. I need to review this issue. Go back and look through my notes. I'm not able to do it on the spot. I'm trying to, but I'm not finding anything, and I want to be able to be informed. So do you want to start earlier? We can start at 8:30 and have the jury here at 9, if that helps with your witness availability.
is he there? Oh, he's in Washington State, so that's 5:30 in the morning for Dr. Conner.
Oops. There's a 3-hour time difference?
Apparently.
So he was gonna start this morning at 6?
Yes. 6:30.
Okay, so what was your suggestion?
I would like to continue through the rest of the day, but if the court doesn't want to, we'll just start at the same time tomorrow.
Okay, but I don't wanna have the jurors waiting, so how long will it take to hash out this issue, and what time are we meeting before the witness, continues?
well, it's like you said, Your Honor, it's 4:30. Why don't we just start tomorrow?
That's what I'm saying, I'm just
Okay.
trying to figure out the time. Okay, I'm just gonna make a decision. Tomorrow, I'll have the lawyers back at 9, I'll tell the jurors to be back at 9:30.
Okay, great.
And your witness, 9:30, please. Hopefully he's a morning person. Sorry about that, I mean, it's,
No, it's not your fault.
okay, so I'm gonna have the bailiffs excuse the jurors for the evening, tell them to be back at 9:30, and, we're in recess. Dr. Connor, we are in recess, please, Dr. Connor, this is Judge Scher, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can hear
Okay,
you.
we're gonna recess until tomorrow. I just want to let you know that, the rule of sequestration has been, invoked, so please don't discuss your testimony. Between today and tomorrow, he's an expert witness. But you're not gonna be consulting him regarding another expert testimony between today and tomorrow.
The only thing that I would communicate with him would be about his availability in the morning and what time.
Okay, well, that doesn't count. That's scheduling. Okay. All right, thank you. The
So
attorney-
I'm dismissed for the day?
Yes, sir. The attorney, Mr. Secor, will be in touch about what time we need you back tomorrow, okay?
All right,
Why don't we do
that's
while the witness is
problem.
online? You can tell us what. When to be available.
But he wants to, okay, what time, sure, approach the podium. This seems like an overly difficult task.
Hey, Don, can you hear
I'm
me?
making it overly
I can hear you.
We have an issue that we need to resolve pertaining to your cross-examination, and we were gonna try to get it done today, but can you testify tomorrow morning?
I have an in-custody evaluation scheduled all day tomorrow.
Okay, so, here's the thing, sir. You have an in-custody evaluation at 6 o'clock in the morning?
I have to be up to the facility by 7:30,
You're gonna have to. push
and
it
it's an
back.
hour drive from where I live.
Sir, I'm sorry, things happen, you're gonna have to push it back. I need you here, you're under subpoena, I'm not excusing you. Please make yourself available at 9:30 so the state can cross-examine you.
Very well.
All right, thank you.
There